The following is a Frank R. Wilson presentation. Welcome to where we celebrate music from the movies. From the golden age to present day, we've got it covered. We talk to those from the industry and learn about them and their favorite scores. Welcome to What's the Score? I'm your host, Frank R. Wilson. So let's take a look at the shelf of CDs and see what we're going to play today. Recognize that music? It's a favorite of our guest today. Now, in his normal life, he's a qualified jeweler, but in a secret life, he's a long-time collector of soundtracks, a very passionate collector of soundtracks. Most notably, you might say that he's best known as being a co-presenter of a hugely popular podcast called James Bond Radio. We'll learn about all these different things today as we go through the program. But for now, please join me in welcoming Brian Dobson to the program. Hi, Brian.
Well, thank you very much, Frank. I'm hardly recognize myself with that introduction. Thank you.
Well, you sent me 20 quid to, say it that way. So, no, listen, we appreciate you taking time to be with us today. I love your list because it's quite diverse. So I think we'll have some fun today, and our listeners will as well. As we usually do in our programs when we have a guest, we like to learn a little bit about them outside of, their connection to the entertainment industry and outside of soundtracks. So if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself growing up and, what you do outside of the James Bond stuff and outside of soundtracks.
Yeah, well, going back to when I was a child, I grew up in the northeast of England in a place called Durham. And then, I spent my early years becoming fascinated by the soundtracks of not just Bond, which obviously I became fairly heavily invested in over time, but also a huge amount of variety of film music and instrumentals. I was particularly more keen on at the time than I was on, vocal pieces. I then moved further south when I was in my kind of late teens, early 20s, pursued my current career in the jewelry business, which is subsequently diversified into the watch business, but it's largely the same. To sort of talk about myself now, obviously, I'm a big collector of soundtracks. I'm passionate on all things Bond. I like to sort of keep myself reasonably fit of late. I've been doing quite a lot of running. I play a game called it's less popular over the US, but in the UK of snooker, a little bit like pool billiards.
Right. I was going to bring that up in a little bit, and so maybe we can save that because I do want to ask you about that. I noticed that
sure.
You shared that with me. So, well, it sounds like you have very diverse interests, and in fact, I'm going to be interested in learning more about what your work is as a jeweler as well, because I'd like to learn more about that. But why don't we? Because you've got a lot of good cues to choose from today. Why don't we just go ahead and dive into one of those then?
Absolutely.
The first one you chose is great, and I hear that a lot of audiophiles love this recording. We're talking about the spoof in 1967 of James Bond called Casino Royale. performed by Herb Alpert. Tell us a little bit about why that made your list of favorites.
Well, a very interesting story there is my first soundtrack album that I ever purchased or was ever bought for me was a musical Bond collection by Jeff Love and his orchestra called Big Bond Movie Themes.
Hmm.
And I received that probably, I don't know, 1976, 1977, around about that sort of time. Didn't realize that there was quite so many Bond films in the canon then, because I was just a young kid, just getting really into it, and was mystified by all these movie titles. And then I realized some of them were official productions, and I saw one called Casino Royale. I thought, I've never even heard of that. And I played the cue at the time, obviously not the original piece, but the cue that was done at the time, and I thought, this is really kind of jaunty, kind of lively, kind of upbeat. Obviously hadn't at that stage listened to the soundtrack, and because it was on this particular album, I kind of absolutely played this album to death, from the James Bond theme right up to, I think, the final track on that album was The Man with the Golden Gun. So that tells you the sort of time period that came out.
Okay.
And I just particularly liked this Casino Royale, even though I couldn't find it as a mainstream Bond film. Obviously, I realize why now. I didn't realize at the time, but I just liked the style of it. It was kind of upbeat. It was chirpy. It was relaxed, and yeah, I just played it to death, really.
Yeah, and like I said, it's really interesting that apparently a lot of audiophiles love this recording. There was something exceptional in the recording of this whole soundtrack that made the sound on it just terrific, and hopefully that'll come through when we play it here. Let's hear it for ourselves. This is the main theme from the 1967 film Casino Royale. It's written, as I recall, by Burt Bacharach and performed by Herb Alpert. You mentioned the fact that you are a qualified jeweler and then gotten into, and that's somehow translated into watches. Help me understand that a little bit. What this is just because I don't know. What does a qualified jeweler do? I mean, what is it that you actually do? Do you design and put together jewelry, or is it you just sell it and maybe occasionally repair it and clean it, or just kind of give me a sense of what you do in that kind
Yeah,
of work?
it's been very wide ranging over the years, but it really started out when I was late teens, early 20s, and took a job at a local jewelry store. And my sort of remit was looking after the watch side of things. And gradually, I basically took this position, didn't really know where it was going to go. I thought it may just end up being a casual job until I decided really what I wanted to do. And then I found out that there was quite a lot to learn. Obviously, diamond qualities, cuts, the repair side, gold, silver, giftware. There's a huge spectrum to kind of understand, and I realized that there was a lot more to this than meets the eye.
Hmm.
Um, and I basically kind of managed to learn the business effectively as a beginner. And then there was some actually sort of professional qualifications that I was allowed to study as part of my learning on the job, as it were. And I just found it kind of snowballed really, and then I kind of learned a little bit more about about the craft, about the industry, about what's good, what's not good, and everything in between. And then it just kind of diversified into doing other positions, but always, or usually always, within the industry.
Well, so do you actually design pieces?
I have done
Uh-huh.
in the past, but it's probably not my particular forte these days. But I did do that at one stage, yes.
Do you find yourself sometimes when you see people in your life, or you're watching a film or something, and you can, I mean, do you have a tendency to look at the jewelry and make a judgment on it or anything like that?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely, and obviously, it has featured in Bond over the years,
Mm.
both in pieces worn and Vespa's necklace. Obviously, we'll maybe come to that, and so I think it's yeah, I do tend to look out for it more, and I can notice when there's a particularly nice piece or yeah.
And it's interesting too. They don't use fake stuff in the movies. I mean, even though they could probably get away with it, they're
Yeah,
using the real
yeah,
deal. When it comes to diamonds and gold and things like that, it's quite amazing.
yeah, absolutely. And I think that can show obviously on the big screen, because you get a certain light refraction with using real diamonds than you would with
Huh.
than
Okay.
like a simulant, if you like.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. The next cue you chose was by a composer that I actually rather like, although I don't have a lot of his stuff. But I'm not familiar with this particular one, so I'm anxious to hear it and hear your thoughts on it. I'm talking about a film called Get Carter, and the composer is Roy Budd. Tell me a little bit about how that made your list of favorites.
Oh, again, that goes back a long time. This particular film has a lot of resonance for me. It's set actually where I grew up, around the northeast, in particular Newcastle upon Tyne, and basically the story evolves around Michael Caine, who is basically visiting the northeast to try and track down his brother has been killed recently, and he's trying to track who the actual killer is. And it resonates, the story, because a lot of it is filmed in various places I grew up in, that I recognize the locations. Obviously, many of them have changed today from when the film was originally released
Hmm.
back in 71, but a lot of the locations are still today the same.
And Roy Budd is he's English, I take it.
Yeah, that's right. And he's done a few other film scores. There's another one that I'm particularly keen on. But I remember seeing this film, arguably when I was probably too young to watch it, and
Hmm.
it just grabbed me. The style of it, the pace of it, it's quite dark, it's quite moody. But one thing that struck me straight away from the get go was this unique sound at the beginning of the film, and basically he's on a train visiting the northeast of England from London, and this cue is played throughout the train journey, and I just think it's a fascinating piece.
Okay, well, let's you've whetted our appetite enough there. Let's have a listen to this. This is from the film Get Carter, and it's written by composer Roy Budd. You have a really diverse list of cues that you've chosen, and I do notice that most of them are they're not necessarily current films or current composers. So you prefer, looks like from what I can tell, like from the 70s and the 80s, things like that. Tell me a little bit about. Do you have any favorite composers that you like? I mean, because you've got a wide variety of different sounds here, so I'm kind of curious. Are there some that you gravitate to more than others?
Yeah, well, that's a good question, Frank, and yeah, thank you for that. Yes, I think generally speaking, they're certainly more 70s, 80s, maybe a little bit of 90s, but uh, the king of composers for me personally would be John Barry. I listen to a lot of John Barry. I think, but both his Bond work and non-Bond work, I think it's quite extraordinary. That is really where I would certainly gravitate to. But there's obviously been lots of different other composers in the mix of that. But certainly he would be my favorite.
But what would be like your top three or top five then? I'm just kind of curious.
What if composers or actual
Yeah,
soundtracks
yeah,
from John Barry?
composers, yeah.
I would say well, certainly John Barry. Certainly from modern day, it would be David Arnold.
Hmm.
Um, the Jerry Goldsmiths would be very high on my list. Uh, Ennio Morricone, I think, is terrific, and obviously Mr. Star Wars, John Williams. I think he's done some terrific stuff over the years,
Yeah,
and
that's a great list.
mm,
And really, well, I mean, they don't have a consistent. There's not a consistency amongst them. They do have their own styles and those sorts of things. So it's you showed diversity just in that list in itself. And talking about diversity, this next cue that you chose was fascinated me because I'm not a particular fan of it, but I'm willing to give it a try here. We're talking about a film called Flash Gordon. You chose the battle theme, which is, I guess, written and performed by Queen, right?
yeah, well,
Tell us a
again,
little bit about how that made your list, because that's
yeah,
really different than everything else you've been talking about.
yeah, it is, and I really felt I had to include it. Um, Growing up, I think everybody has their unique favorite, artist or group or band or whatever.
Hmm.
Mine was always Queen.
Okay.
I thought they were very very diverse in I guess which is a little bit like my list today really, but they were always diverse from uh, softer ballads to much harder rock, and I followed their career, throughout the 70s and 80s, and I really feel that I couldn't have made a list like I have today without including Queen. And one of my early soundtracks that I purchased was this particular movie, A Flash Gordon, and it's very unique in style. It's very very different. There's lots of different particular cues on that album, and it was very very difficult to pick one. The vocal arrangement of this is called The Hero, but the instrumental version is called The Battle Theme. And this, again, this particular soundtrack was just something that I purchased back in the day. I was probably 9 or 10 or something like that when this
Hmm.
came out, and I bought it on a cassette at the time, and I just played the life out of it. I just thought it was quite unique. So I really couldn't put this list together without mentioning or tipping my hat to Queen.
Okay, well, let's have a listen for ourselves. This is again from the film Flash Gordon. The cue is called Battle Theme, and it's written and performed by Queen.
peace of mind. Right.
You mentioned earlier about snooker, and I've always thought I understand it, and then I'll end up seeing it on television, and I say, no, I guess I don't understand it. And you seem to be quite an accomplished snooker player. Talk to me a little bit about that. How did you get interested in that? And then after that, if you could help those of us who aren't as familiar. I mean, I know billiards, I know pool, that kind of stuff, but if you can also kind of help us understand what's the difference between snooker and more standard games that most of us know.
Yeah, snooker's a little bit more. I think it's a little bit more complex. It's a little bit. It's often been described as chess with balls.
Okay.
It's a little bit more thought provoking, I think. It is obviously played on what would be a pool table or a billiard table. There's obviously there's a lot more maybe variety in it because there's so many different combinations of different shots or sequences of shots, but essentially that kind of started back in again round about the same time as the Flash Gordon thing, really, to be honest. I kind of came across that on TV, and it was quite new at the time because snooker was something which was originally devised, not the game, but the TV was basically brought in when colour television started to become popular, and the executives of some of the UK TV programs wanted something which was quite colourful, and started to broadcast snooker because it was diverse with lots of different coloured balls, you see, played on obviously a green table, and then that was basically how it became popular. I started to watch it. I was kind of fascinated by it, and I just thought this is quite unique. And I progressed to my parents buying me like a half-size table, which you could fit into like a living room or a dining room kind of thing, and I just started to play it, started to become of a reasonably good standard at it. Certainly, I did kind of like local competitions growing up, and sort of won a few competitions with it. And I just was fascinated not only with the professional game, which was very, very big in the UK. It was possibly less so in other parts of the world, although it has expanded a little bit since.
That was going to be my next question, because I thought it was largely really just something that took place in the UK, but you are seeing growth internationally as well.
Oh, absolutely! It's huge in China at the moment. Very, very, very big in the Far East. It's certainly spread throughout Europe now. And there's kind of possibly one area where it hasn't really progressed, is possibly in the US, but it's also quite big in Canada. So there is pockets of no pun intended of kind of growth in various places.
Okay. Going back to music, the next one that you chose is a favorite of mine as well. We're talking about Star Trek: The Wrath of Khan, which, if memory serves, was the second film that came out, I think.
Yeah.
I believe this is the main theme that you had chosen from it, written by James Horner. Tell us a little bit about how it was that made your list of favorites.
Yeah, well, growing up, both my father and myself were very, very keen Star Trek fans, especially of the original series. And I grew up watching a lot of the old Star Treks, and then when the Star Trek, the original motion picture, came out, I think I was possibly a little bit young to kind of maybe grasp it or understand it. And then when the second film came out, I just remember very much it's a case of reminiscing at the time, and I listened to the music of that. I bought the soundtrack before I actually saw the film, and I just blew me away because I just thought it was so unique and orchestral, and it just resonated with me. And subsequently to this day, it is by far and away my favorite Star Trek film, and
Yeah.
I can watch that literally over and over and over again, and the cues throughout that are really really strong. But the main theme or the end theme on this is just particularly it just does something to me. It really gets the blood pumping a bit.
Yeah. And I recall too, the first Star Trek came out, other than the score, which I loved. The movie didn't really work for me that well, and I was really kind of concerned, when the new one was coming out, and I said, "Oh, geez, I hope they don't mess it up this time." And it was terrific. I loved the second one, and
Yeah.
and kind of like you, I might say that might be, I don't know if it's my number one favorite, but it's certainly up there. So, let's have a listen to this. This is the main theme I think you chose, correct?
Yeah, that's
Okay,
that's the one. Yeah.
the main theme from Star Trek: The Wrath of Khan, and it's written by James Horner.
Space. The final frontier. These are the continuing voyages of the starship Enterprise. Their ongoing mission: to explore strange new worlds, to seek out new life forms and new civilizations, to boldly go where no man has gone before.
Before we continue with our guest, I wanted to let you know about a new way you can support the program. In conjunction with a company called Patreon, I'm creating a membership model for the podcast. Now, first of all, it'll always be free to listen to, so nothing about that changes. But I have set up a way that you can join as a member of our club, so to speak, and at different levels, hopefully very reasonably priced for you. And to think of it as a tip in the tip jar. If you like what you hear, if you're enjoying it and want it to continue, a little tip in the tip jar is what we're hoping and asking for. Now, you can visit our Facebook page for more details, or you can visit patreon.com, and that's patreon.com/what's the score. That's all one word, what's the score. Check it out and see if it's something that you're willing to do. And as always, we appreciate all of our listeners for their support of the program. Now we'll get back to our guest and more great movie music.
I see here in your notes that you were kind enough to share with me that you had the opportunity to live in some different places that are a little different, like Portugal, and I think you said Nassau as well, which I'm assuming is the Bahamas.
That's right.
Tell us a little bit of that. That's kind of a unique experience. A lot of people have the benefit of being able to travel the world, and that's great in its own right. But to actually live and absorb yourself into the culture of other countries, I think, is even more fascinating. Tell us a little bit about what that experience was like.
Yeah, that was fascinating. Again, that was actually a position through my jewelry work, and I got offered, I actually saw a job advert for working for a company selling jewelry in the Caribbean, and I thought, well, it almost sounds a little bit too good to be true. And I thought, that especially with my love of Bond, I just thought that would be such a unique opportunity to travel to places which were quite unique, quite special. And I just before that came up, I took a job on a cruise liner, and that cruise liner was going throughout the the Caribbean, various places in the US, Alaska, all kinds of places, and basically it was a case of waking. Literally, you would wake up the next day and you were in a completely different, city, country, and I just found it quite fascinating. And then
what did you do? What did you do on a cruise ship then? I mean, you didn't like design or sell jewelry, did you? Or
would you believe it? Yes, I did.
Really?
That's exactly what I did. And it was very, very similar to working in a obviously any kind of high street shopping mall store, but it was just the fact that when the ship was docked in port, you had a free time to really explore the island. So I managed to clock up a little bit of time, I suppose, visiting places that I hadn't ever seen before and possibly will not go to again. So that was quite unique. And this particular position I was offered was based in Nassau, and obviously with my Thunderball interest as well as the interest I had obviously from the my employment, was I just obviously couldn't say no. It was too good to be true, really, and and I went over there for about a week or 10 days just to sort of see if this was for me, see if I really was going to enjoy it, and there was just so much to take in terms of the culture change, different ways of working, the climate, etc., etc.
Sure.
That I came back to the UK, thought about it, and thought, well, it's too good an opportunity. So I lived there for a good period of time, and obviously managed to do a little bit of diving and snorkeling and kind of live a little bit of the Bond lifestyle, and also kind of just taking the locations used in Thunderball and Never Say Never Again, and yeah, fascinating.
Wow, and you mentioned Portugal as well. Was that kind of a similar situation where it was work related that you ended up living there for a while?
Yeah, absolutely. That was a work related position, and there was a position in the Algarve in southern Portugal, and I lived there for about a year, about 12 months. And that was a kind of a similar situation where it was just it was not without its difficulties, because obviously the sort of language barrier and way of life was kind of different. It's very, very different to going away on a holiday or a vacation, because you have to get used to I suppose different lifestyle. But again, that was fascinating, and it's to this day, my kind of love of travel is still very, very very, very prevalent.
Yeah, from your list, I can tell that you seem to have a real affinity for science fiction. One of the next cues that you chose is called The Battle in the Snow. This comes from a film, The Empire Strikes Back. Everybody knows what that film is and who wrote that. Tell us a little bit about how it was that made your list of favorites.
Yeah, well, again, growing up, I was always a Star Wars fan, but I was never a huge Star Wars fan because back in the day, my father took me to see The Spy Who Loved Me back in '77 when Star Wars came out, and a lot of my peer group at the time were very, very into Star Wars and collecting the figures and the the paraphernalia that went through it. But for me, it was more Bond that resonated. Anyway, I did enjoy the original Star Wars, of course I did. But when it got to The Empire Strikes Back, I just my level of interest really massively increased, because I just much preferred the style of that film. Again, very, very similar time is I bought the album, listened to the album, and was blown away with the actual the pace and the style of it. And even though the Star Wars theme is obviously universally known, and I guess the Darth Vader's theme, the Imperial March, is very, very high on people's list as well. But the track that resonated with me most was the very, very last track on that Empire Strikes Back album. And it was just the kind of sense of danger and attack which is used from the beginning of the film.
Okay, well, let's have a listen for ourselves. This cue is called The Battle in the Snow. It's from the film The Empire Strikes Back, and it's written, of course, by the maestro John Williams. when we introduced you, we mentioned the fact that you're a co-presenter on James Bond Radio. Could you tell us a little bit about how that came about and just what exactly is James Bond Radio?
Sure. Well, James Bond Radio is such a strong force within the James Bond community podcast, and it's brought together so many people who share the same common bond, dare I say, the Q, and it's basically was set up by a couple of guys, Tom and Chris, who were basically very, very big Bond aficionados. But it's grown into something a lot more than that, and it's grown into a community of people, of like-minded people, and I'm very sort of honoured and privileged that I've got a lot of close friends through James Bond Radio, and it's become a very, very big part of my life. And we have regular kind of meetups where we sort of discuss the Bond universe, and obviously and also go to various locations that we used within the films, which has brought a lot of certainly a lot of enjoyment to my life, and I know to a lot of other people's. And the various people that has been brought together through James Bond Radio, we've formed some very close friendships, and it's just been a kind of just a celebration and a love of all things James Bond.
Yeah. So, and how was it that you got connected with it then? Because you weren't part of the original group that did it, I guess.
No, not at all. I actually I was just a fan, and still am to this day. And I'll tell exactly what happened. Is I was driving one day in the car, and I suddenly thought to myself, I wonder if there's such a thing as a James Bond podcast. I assume that's rather niche and it's rather specialist. There probably won't be, but I'll have a flick and see if I can find anything. Sure enough, I found this particular podcast called James Bond Radio. It was one of the very, very early editions, maybe episode 1 or 2. I managed to catch it in its infancy.
Mm-hmm.
I played it and I thought, these two guys who presented have a real good chemistry together, and but not only that, but I was learning, and I felt straight away that there was a huge affinity with this, and I also thought the people who they had on and who were interviewing and what they were talking about was just sort of struck a chord with me that I thought I'd like to be part of this. So there was various Facebook chats and various kind of, as I say, meetups, and it's something which has snowballed, and it's to a degree where everybody is very passionate about it, and I sort of managed to look after some of their social media output as time had gone on, and then we decided to have a little bit of a shake-up of the formula, and they wanted to sort of try something new and have various different maybe group kind of presentations or different styles where 2 or 3 people would do like a round table kind of podcast, or maybe one person would do a different podcast of a specialism within the Bond world that was unique to them. I said I would be interested, and Tom Sears, who co-presents that, was keen enough to sort of work with me on it. But I think that the most important thing with it is the unique friendships that it's brought.
Yeah, and I would agree. I mean, that's I've been overwhelmed by the first of all finding out that there were so many different and there's a lot of podcasts out there now on the James Bond phenomenon, and that's been a real joy to discover, and as a result, I've made a lot of friends that I've never met in person before, but I still feel like we're very close friends. It's mind-boggling the way it works, but I'm glad you're a part of it, and we'll talk a little bit more about that when we wrap things up. But it's a good segue to your next cue, which happens to be from a Bond film. In fact, the only one that you could say it was a little bit of science fiction, although I can remember Cubby Broccoli saying, it's science fact. we're talking about the film Moonraker. The cue is called Flight into Space, written, of course, by John Barry. That's a rather long cue, and well, just tell us a little bit about how it made your list of favorites.
Yeah, that is probably one of the hardest decisions in compiling this list of music, because John Barry for me is as I say, the king, and I could have given you a cue from every single film he's done, to be honest, and I thought it would be good maybe just to obviously try and narrow it down to one. Thunderball soundtrack is very, very high on my list, as is On Her Majesty's Secret Service. But I think if I had to pick one, and it's almost, it's a very, very difficult decision, but if I had to pick up with one, I'm particularly keen on the Moonraker soundtrack, even though it's a little bit maybe unexpanded. I think that it's a fairly short soundtrack, but there's so much music on there which is very, very grand, very, very majestic. Some of it almost not even quite Bond-like. But I remember back in the day, actually, obviously seeing Moonraker and just being mesmerized with the score. But there's 3 or 4 cues on that particular soundtrack which I love. But if I had to pick one of them, I think there's a John Barry always seems to capture the mood rather well, and I think this, as the title suggests, Flight into Space, captures that very, very well.
Yeah, for longtime listeners of the program, you may recall that I have an episode, and if you haven't heard it before, I would encourage you to look it up. I have an episode where I actually conducted a short interview with John Barry many, many years ago, as a young 20-something, and one of the things he mentioned was that he particularly liked the space music, as he called it, in Moonraker. So it's actually amongst some of his favorites as well. So let's have a listen to this. This is again from the film Moonraker. The cue is called Flight into Space, and it's written by the maestro John Barry. So what are your thoughts? Just for people that might be listening to this at a different time of year, we're taping this as the coronavirus has still got a hold on society, and it actually had delayed the opening of a lot of films, not the least of which was the new Bond film, No Time to Die. Do you what are your thoughts on that? It looks to me in retrospect to probably have been a good call, you think?
Yeah, I totally and utterly agree with you, Frank. I think at the time, when I first heard the news, I was absolutely devastated because I thought there's so much planning and level of anticipation ready for the new film. I mean, there always is surrounding a new Bond release, but especially now with the fact that the film has been delayed multiple times, and the fact we've obviously had to wait 5 years since the previous installment as well. And so I'd really geared myself up for this April release. I know a few of my friends within the Bond community were all waiting for that moment as well. And when I first heard of the reason why the film was delayed, it's just amazing what a difference a few weeks makes. I thought it doesn't really seem a strong enough reason. And then obviously where we are now is very, very concerning from a health point of view. And obviously it was totally and utterly the right choice.
Yeah, I don't buy this talk about this was an excuse for them to do some reshoots and that the test screenings went bad. I just think that's crazy. And that's one of the things that's actually pretty crazy about life these days is you get a lot of misinformation that gets spread around as fact, and it's very frustrating sometimes.
Well, the internet is full of it, isn't it? Really?
Yeah. You chose a classic score from a Western that I think you could say is near the top of anybody's list. The film is A Fistful of Dollars, written by Ennio Morricone. Tell us how it was that was to make your list of favorites.
Very, very similar to my original big Bond movie themes. I had an album by Jeff Love and his orchestra at the time, back in the 70s, which featured various Western themes, and again I liked them all. There was some such strong music, and I just came across A Fistful of Dollars. I must admit I hadn't seen the film at that stage, but I was just playing this particular soundtrack in the order that it came out, and I heard this piece of music and I thought, oh, that is so distinctive, that is so unique. And again, I played that cue over and over again, long before I actually ever saw the film. And I couldn't quite imagine what the scenes were that went with that music or why that was chosen. But I just thought it was quite unique, and still do to this day.
Yeah, and you think about it. I mean, some of the films in this time period that Morricone did, he really established. He established the Western sound or the Western style of doing a score, much like Barry created the sounder style for a Bond score. And there were a lot of people that you've noticed in other Westerns that sometimes go back to what Morricone had written and kind of pay homage to him. Let's have a listen to this. This is the main theme, I take it?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, the main theme from the film, A Fistful of Dollars, written by one of the most prolific composers of all time, Ennio Morricone. What's in your future right now? And just in general, where's James Bond Radio going? What's in your future as it pertains to your areas of interest?
Yeah, well, that's a very, very good question, because as you were saying earlier, the as it stands currently, the coronavirus is grabbed a hold of society where we none of us are quite sure where things are heading. I would obviously like to contribute as much as I can in the Bond world. And I think at the moment it really is literally just taking one day at a time, I think.
Yeah, you're right. But I mean, will you be on future episodes of James Bond Radio? Is that how you?
Well, I certainly hope so. Yes. And I enjoy the world of Bond. I enjoy the world of podcasting. I'm very, very grateful to be on your program right now, and I think I'd certainly like to do a bit more of it, for sure.
Oh, well, I appreciate that, and in fact, that's a great way to kind of wrap things up for today. I can't thank you enough for making time to spend some time with us and put together this list and share it with us. It's some great music in there that I hope our listeners enjoyed. I would, again, just extend my most heartfelt thanks for you joining us today, Brian.
It's been an honor and a privilege, so thank you very much.
Excellent.
That does wrap up things for us today. Once again, if you enjoy the program, please consider becoming a patron. Details about that can be found on our Facebook page. With that, there's only one thing left to say, and that's simply this. My name is Frank R. Wilson. My time's up. I thank you for yours. Thanks for listening to What's the Score?